Welcome to our webinar, Post-COVID Canada, the Need for a New Industrial Policy. My name is Alan Gregg. I'm one of 38 principals at the Ernst Cliff Strategy Group. Those of you who might not be familiar with our firm, we are a public affairs strategy company with subject matter expertise in government relations, strategic communications, and public opinion research. We got a great panel today. I want to start with two of our own superstars, Carleen Dick, who is a principal out of our Vancouver office, BC office, Velma McCall, who is a principal out of our Ottawa office. And we're joined by two very interesting fellows, Sean Spear and Robert Asselin. Both of them have more titles and accolades than professional curlers. They're both associated with the Monk Center, and they have just released a paper that's causing a mild sensation out of the Public Policy Forum called, I want to make sure I get this right, New North Star 2, a challenge-driven industrial strategy for the age of intangibles. Before we start, as is my wont, I like to do a little check-in on grooming and hygiene for reasons that probably are fairly clear. So who has had to cut their own hair in the last 5? Put up your hands, come on. Oh, the audience, we've got a little button down there that you can put questions in or responding. Out of 106 people who are watching right now, 82 have had to cut their own hair in the last 5 weeks. So with that firmly established, let me begin. I want to start with you, Sean, because we're in a period of kind of hyper partisanship where politicos, their first tendency is to want to put their foot on their opponent's throat. Here you are, prominent conservative, joining up with Robert, prominent liberal, to generate innovative public policy. Give us some sense of how you guys got together and what's your purpose. What are you trying to do here?
Well, thanks, Alan. Thanks to you and the team at Ernst Cliff for hosting the discussion today and for drawing some attention to the report that, as you said, we released yesterday with the Public Policy Forum. I'd be remiss before starting if not recognizing Ed Greenspan and the team at the Public Policy Forum for enabling Robert and I to come together along with our third co-author, Royce Mendez, to produce this new report.
From the CIBC.
Exactly. The reason we've come together on this issue, Alan, is because for us, Canada's economic competitiveness ought to transcend partisanship. Canadian public policy, the Canadian economy has been well served for the better part of the last quarter century or so because of a multi-partisan consensus around taxation, around free trade, around public finances, and other issues. The problem is that consensus is increasingly not responsive to the new sources of economic value, the intangibles economy as we describe it, and the geopolitical competition that the intangibles economy is fueling. And so what we're aiming to do with this release and with our ongoing activities to draw attention to our analysis and recommendations is to try to cultivate a new political consensus, a new public policy consensus in Canada across the political spectrum, so that Canada is better placed to respond to this interplay between the intangible economy, intangible capital, and the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China that this new type of economy is fueling.
I want to ask Robert, because I understand that you guys were reluctant to even call what you're advocating industrial policy.
Yeah.
I mean, over the years, the whole idea of industrial policy has kind of caught a bad odor. The government's picking winners and losers and creating all kinds of market inefficiencies. But you're saying there's a new way of approaching industrial policy. Why new? What's changed? What's different now than in the past that makes industrial policy relevant today?
Yeah, I think that's a great opening question. Thank you to you, Alan. It's a great privilege, and thank you to Ernst Cliff for the invitation. I think it's worth unpacking a bit the foundational elements of our thinking here. Why have we come to this point where we talk about industrial policy, as you say, something that looks a bit aged, to be honest? For more or less the last 40 years, Canada has operated under, I'll say, a series of assumptions and anchors on its own economic framework. One of which was what we call in a paper, and that's universally recognized as the Washington Consensus. As you well know, Alan, that came to be in about 40 years ago in the 80s. It was personified by Reagan, Ronald Reagan, obviously, Thatcher, and to a certain degree, Mulroney, Prime Minister Mulroney in Canada. The idea was, of course, that government had done a bit of overreach in the 70s, and it was time to kind of get out of the way. So the idea, of course, was to kind of set a global set of rules for the new liberal order, and basically let countries do free trade and kind of get government out of the way. In fact, in the 90s, the Clinton administration brought China in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, thinking that even China could adhere to this global set of liberal rules for trading. As we find out, obviously, China used massive industrial policy, and it worked pretty well for China. But as a result, obviously, China became a superpower on the economic front, and not just on typical sectors. It became a global tech power. So here we are today, basically, with the United States worrying that they have lost. We have to realize that the U.S. was never really challenged since the World War II on its economic power, military power, technological power. And here's China basically going at them very hard and winning on many fronts, including on technology. I think the 5G example is quite telling. And so this is what people are referring essentially as the new tech Cold War between the US and China. And so as a result, really what the US is doing is building its own industrial capacity to respond to China. As it's also, more importantly for Canada, I think, it's contesting the global liberal order I just mentioned and basically ditching the Washington Consensus away. And so as a result, other countries, other regional economies like the European Union, United Kingdom, France, Germany are adopting their own industrial policy because they know that this global order we just talked about is no more reliable. So it puts Canada, a trading nation by definition, in a very tough spot, obviously. And this is why we think, we have come to think a bit reluctantly that we need to do our own industrial policy, but a very modern version of industrial policy. Obviously we'll talk about it, but that's the first big point. I'm sorry that it's taking a bit of time. The second point, I think the second anchor that is really important in our thinking is this change that is happening in the economy. What we have called in both of our papers, the rise of the intangibles economy. Essentially what we mean by that is that there has been a huge shift in where economic value is in the economy. If you look at the S&P 500 right now, you would have the 5 largest stock accounting for 20% of total market cap. And those stocks, of course, are Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook, all of them essentially intangibles company. And lastly, I think this matters a great deal to us. As an anchor, we used to rely on the United States as a safe and easy partner to deal with. We now know, obviously, that this has become more difficult. We've gone to having our best partner commercially putting tariffs on aluminum and on steel on national security grounds. Something that nobody, I think, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, would have thought would be possible. And so all of these kind of key anchors that we used to take for granted are gone, and we think that we have to have a more, strategic conversation amongst ourselves as what's the best way going forward. So the industrial policy we're thinking about is not one that is rooted in nostalgia. Is one that is linking our public R&D with market outcomes in a better way, that is using human capital as a strength. We do immigration and PSC quite well in Canada. And largely, and I'll finish with this, you know, the model that we want to put forward or that we are proposing is one where government and private sector come together to co-create demand for new technologies, new products, and new services. So
Well, I
I'll
want to get
stop
into
there.
that
I'm sorry I was a bit long, but I
granularly.
thought it was important to just unpack.
I want to get into that as granularly as I can. But first, I mean, Carling, this conversation is very timely because we've seen over the last 10 days a huge pivot in terms of public policy dialogue, not away from public health, but certainly increasingly to the economic reopening of the country, guided by public health. When we first started talking about this webinar, 10 days ago, it looked like BC was going to be the first out of the gate in terms of offering its guidance, in terms of how the economy was going to open, because their public health record looked to be the best in the country. Now it looks like they're going to be the last. What's happening in the province? Why the delay? And what might we expect and anticipate when that guidance is brought forward from BC?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Alan. It's interesting to me. A week ago, we were saying, you know, British Columbia had sort of started the conversation about opening up the economy, but they started the conversation actually earlier than last week when they appointed their economic recovery task force. And I think we're going to talk about that a little later. But they started the Economic Recovery Task Force back on April 2nd. So they've been talking about economic recovery for the first time, but sort of more publicly last week. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of other provinces sort of jumped ahead of them. Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario have all sort of talked about how they might start reopening. BC is taking a much more cautious approach to their announcement about when they're going to restart the economy. The Premier said he doesn't want to give people false hope about the date when this all might happen. He's constantly said it's going to be guided by Dr. Henry, our public health officer. But I mean, BC still might be. They might be one of the last to announce their plans, but they might be one of the first to open up the economy. I mean, we have 2,000 cases in British Columbia, 100 deaths, and yesterday 55 new cases. Comparing that to Ontario, that has 15,000 cases, almost 1,000 deaths, and yesterday I think they said they had 347 new cases, which is actually the lowest in a few weeks, but it's a bit different than 55 new cases in British Columbia. So the Premier has said in the coming days and weeks, we're going to hear more about British Columbia's reopening plans. But also the health minister mentioned that BC took sort of a different approach restricting the economy when they did. So there's lots of industries in British Columbia, or at least a few in British Columbia, that actually continue to operate, unlike other provinces. So for example, the construction industry. British Columbia, the construction sites are still operating under strict guidelines, obviously, but they continue to operate, and that's not the case in other provinces. So when we start opening up our economy, it might look a little different than what others are doing.
Velma, you're kind of a bridge between government and the private sector, and we're going to get into the specifics that Sean and Robert are recommending. But I want to know a little bit about the federal government's thinking. I mean, are they just saying, look, what we have to do is we just have to build a bridge back to where we were pre-COVID and strengthen the companies that are hurt the most? Or are they ready for the notion of a really new industrial policy, looking at economic rebuilding in a way that we haven't in the past?
Thanks, Alan. And it's interesting that you use the word bridge, because I was thinking about exactly that. Sean and Robert have written this paper that's about the very abstract history of where industrial policy has come from. And Carling just brought it right down to earth, because we're in the middle of a crisis. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me about the conversation we're having right now, the federal government, and frankly all governments, is it actually, I think, sets the table very well for the kind of conversation that Sean and Robert are encouraging us to have happen, which is to bring a modern industrial policy forward. And in order to do that, you have to understand in a very specific, detailed way exactly what's happening. So one of the things that I find most interesting about the crisis that we're in, and let's just acknowledge that there's a lot of people and there's a lot of businesses that are facing some serious existential threats. And we've had 6 weeks of pretty high stress and high anxiety while people have tried to pay the bills and feed their families and homeschool their kids and figure out what the future for their businesses are. And some are fundamentally rethinking their business models in the hospitality sector. We also have sectors of the economy that are facing structural changes, and we have the double whammy of the hit on the energy sector or what's happening in fisheries or forestry, and it feeds into the kind of research that Sean and Robert have done on global supply chains, etc. So when you ask what's the federal government thinking, first the federal and every provincial government have thought first and foremost over the last 6 to 7 weeks just of putting in measures in place that will deal with the crisis. And in doing that, what they've all been forced to do, some were more likely to do it, some less, but all have been forced to do it, is have a very detailed conversation about exactly what's happening with the workforce, exactly what is happening in industries, etc. And I think it sets a really interesting and important tableau for us to have a conversation about how we would write a new industrial policy, because government has frankly never been more aware of kind of day-to-day realities, liquidity, we've paid attention to commercial leasing, we've paid attention to all kinds of input costs, whether that's power or it's just we've had to re-examine what it is, the challenges that are facing industry, and I think the government understands that. And the question from here is, how do we pivot beyond reopening to what will actually be that recovery strategy? So I think the federal government is ready to talk about this, and I think some of the things that Robert and Sean have put on the table give us some places to be in that dialogue at a much deeper level.
Well, let's get there. Yeah, I mean,
great.
Go on, Sean.
I would just say Velma's comments are I think really insightful. That the experience of the past several weeks will position the government in an even better way, a more informed way to think about an industrial policy. The other way in which this immediate experience, I think, will help to increase the resonance for this type of thinking is the extent to which the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated tensions between the US and China. We are now seeing policymakers across the political spectrum in Washington calling for a rethink about the American position vis-a-vis China. We're seeing policymakers in the UK similarly across the political spectrum, Australia and elsewhere. And you think about it this way, the US and China represent more than 60% of total Canadian trade. And they're about to a shift from a soft rivalry to a hard rivalry, and that rivalry is not tangential to the intangible capital or the intangibles economy that Robert and I are talking about. These issues are deeply interlinked because of the monopolistic winner-take-all nature of intangible capital, because of the dual purposes typically associated with these technologies. They have both consumer applications and, of course, national security applications. So put yourselves in the shoes of a Canadian policymaker. Our first and third largest trading partners are about to engage in a increasing technology-driven competition. And Canadian policy is going to have to create a framework that enables Canada to navigate this new world and to build capacities and economic scale, industrial scale, so that we can participate in this new global marketplace. I think for that reason, the current experience is really, I think, going to sharpen the minds of Canadian policymakers about this new geopolitical world and the role of Canadian public policy to help us navigate it.
And Alan, can I just jump in here with one thing, because I think there are cross pressures. Yes, yes, there's this, but we also are facing perhaps a renewed call for a North American view about how we deal with, for instance, supply chains, right? So yes, we're dealing with the intangibles, but at the same time, we're about to get very tangible on public health supply chains and having access to our largest trading partner, and making sure that when we start to think about domestic supply chains, that doesn't create a harder border between Canada and the US than we've experienced before. And so we think of things regionally or in a North American context as well.
Well, in fact, Carling's had some interesting experience, but before I get to her about that, about how those supply chains can be shortened on a geographic basis, Robert, I mean, I get the sense that you titled this paper quite deliberately, because it's not just a new industrial policy, it's a challenge-driven industrial policy. How does a challenge-driven industrial policy differ from old industrial policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think most people, remember when Kennedy said he would send an American to the moon.
Right.
And obviously, what that did is that it created, lots of incentives for what has now become an amazing industrial complex in the U.S. You think companies, obviously, in aerospace. Companies, in fact, you could argue that Silicon Valley was born about, from that ambition, creating GPS and internet. Those things were all created because, and those companies grew from public R&D. Basically, what the government said, this is important. I want to send an American to the moon. Let's do it. And then there's this public-private partnership to get there. This is what we mean by a challenge-driven strategy, is that it's kind of a partnership where both the government and the private sector co-create the market. So in a way, you have to think it almost as you creating a demand for new products, new service. Canada historically has been more on the supply side. We have tools like SHRED and tax credits, and those are not like real, in our view, real demand-driven initiatives or programs that allows company to really build something interesting here. So in concrete terms, we've put a few examples in a paper. Climate change is an obvious one.
Right. It's a challenge that our industrial strategy should be aimed against.
Yeah, here's a big problem that we have as a society that we need to solve. How do we get economic actors partnering with the government to solve it? Well, by doing this challenge of saying, we're going to reduce emissions. You guys, private sector actors, you have to help me do this. So please create new technology, create new services, create new products, so we'll get there together. And this, again, this is the moonshot example of what happened in the US.
Well, you make the point by linking moonshot to Silicon Valley that when you have a challenge-driven policy like that, we are going to the moon, it creates tremendous spill-offs, all kinds of things that perhaps weren't initially intended.
Absolutely. And in the US, they have this agency that is called DARPA, that essentially is a research agency. It's similar to NASA, but it's a bit broader in its mandate. The equivalent here, I guess, will be the National Research Center that we have. But DARPA, what they do is they issue challenge and they force companies to compete on those challenges.
Right. And they have identified 4 areas right now, the NRC, haven't they?
Yeah, they are starting this model.
They're fairly narrow.
Interesting. Yeah. But what's interesting was with COVID-19, Prime Minister Trudeau basically set new challenges for NRC to execute on. So this is a perfect example of how this could work for bigger,
you make
or
the
more
point
long-term.
that the government's approach to COVID-19 is actually a challenge-driven response.
Exactly. So
Well,
we have the government basically.
I want to get to Carlin because we started a comment you meant on the supply chain, and then both Sean and Robert have made the point that we can't really rely on the United States like we have in the past. Yet our North American focus is kind of clearly our best bet. I mean, Carlin, you're working on something called the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, which is kind of a loose coalition between California, Oregon, Washington, and BC. Tell us about that. What's the original thinking of why this coalition came together? What do they hope to accomplish it? And do you see this kind of regional blocks, cross-border blocks, as increasingly being a viable economic unit in this new industrial strategy?
Yeah, I think the federal government's not going to be able to do it all on its own. So, well, both federal governments, the US and in Canada. So we need sort of creative governance from provinces and states. And the Cascadia Innovation Corridor has been in existence for, well, I mean, the Cascadia region has been in existence forever, but the Cascadia Innovation Corridor has been in existence for about 4 years now. And essentially, it's a group of governments, companies, and universities that have come together to focus on research, economic development, and transportation. And the reason they've come together is they have a sort of shared sense of identity, growth, employment, and connectivity. So they essentially, what's been happening is they've been encouraging cross-border partnerships. So there's a steering committee and then some subgroups that are focusing on basically different challenges that the entire region needs to contemplate. So one of the great cross-border relationships is a relationship between the University of Washington, UBC, Fred Hutch, and the BC Cancer Institute, and they're all collaborating on finding ways to advance research in cancer. So they're taking their sort of collective expertise and trying to solve big issues. And I think, with everything that's been talked about today, regions like that and partnerships like that are going to be more important than ever as we go forward.
Sean, in the paper you talked that you basically have to ask and answer three big questions. One, what are the challenges that we do face as a nation? And secondly, what's our competitive advantage in grappling with those? And then what are the intersections of those two things? Robert talked about climate change. What are those other challenges that we're facing, and what are our competitive advantages in dealing with them?
It's a great question, Alan, and just to emphasize the point, once we made the intellectual leap to the need for an industrial policy, the question, of course, is what parts of the economy ought we build an industrial policy around? How do you make those judgments? And that's where we settled on this process of a challenge-driven industrial strategy. And the way that governments ought to think about it is precisely the three questions you described. What are the big societal challenges that we need to address? Where do we have comparative advantages, and where do these two considerations intersect? And the example of climate change is such a good one. Every party in Parliament has agreed to meeting Canada's emission reductions targets. We self-evidently have unique capacities in the areas of energy and the sectors associated or in and around energy. So that's an obvious example in our mind. Two others that we highlight in the paper are smart cities, where we have real strengths in the areas of conventional construction, but also in digital infrastructure, engineering, and so on. We also have major demands on and major public commitments around infrastructure spending. So how do we use those public commitments in the area of public infrastructure, not just to get better roads and better highways and better bridges, but really to cultivate new firms, new technologies, new innovations that can then be exported to the world, where we can develop the scale to compete for global market share. And that really is at the heart of the challenge-driven model, Alan, that the paper seeks to set out. We recognize, of course, that different governments, different political parties may identify different challenges that they think ought to be at the center of an industrial policy, and that's fine. But fundamentally, those choices have to be made by applying those three questions that you set out at the beginning. what is the challenge? Where does it we have as pre-existing comparative advantages, and where do those two considerations intersect?
Well, obviously, for this to work, we're going to have to see a level of intersection and cooperation and collaboration between government and business, the likes we have not seen probably since the Second World War.
Right.
I mean, for the last 2 weeks, we've witnessed a massive rollout of subsidization programs, support programs by the government, with, I gather, a tremendous amount of input on the part of business. What's their evaluation of the government's record today, and what is the likelihood that you're going to see that kind of collaboration going forward necessary to do what Sean and Robert are advocating?
Well, I think that their assessment would be that on a couple of things not perfectly designed out of the gate, but I think the government's getting a lot of, and every level of government is getting a lot of credit for listening, because you've seen policies being, like, for many of us who work in the public policy space, you very rarely see a public policy shaped in the public sphere. And in the last 6 weeks, we've actually seen between political parties and between business and government, we've seen the shaping and reshaping of several of these programs, and that will continue. And frankly, I think it's a satisfying process for both government and for business. So I expect that conversation will keep right on moving.
That's very interesting, because I mean, there's many key business leaders, their entire adult life, their philosophy is just get government out of the way, get them off my back. You're sensing a difference in the mindset right now?
Well, I think there's been a shift. I think the role of government is unquestioned across the political spectrum. I mean, even Sean would have been surprised at a few of the voices we've seen calling for universal income and some of the things that we've seen across the country. People recognize that the moment that we're living in is very different from other moments when it might be more comfortable to say that government should just get out of the way. We are faced with a certain set of challenges, and now we have to self-organize ourselves in a different set of ways. Alan, I want to just take a moment and look at a couple of the questions, because one of the things that is coming through in the questions from our viewers is they're asking about whether the programs that are being developed should be tied to innovation, should be tied to climate change, should be tied to outcomes on public health, because I think the questions about what we're good at have, that conversation has blown up into quite a bit of a larger space, because it includes a number of elements on the social policy side. So we have questions around public health and those domestic supply chains. We're having a different kind of conversation about agriculture and our food supply, and how we can domestically supply, like how we can take care of our own needs at home, and what does that look like? And maybe we have some atrophy in our own supply chain system around some of these things. Where you talked about smart cities, Sean, I think it's smart cities plus communities, because I think communities are going to start to speak up and say, well, some of those places where you want some of these products, these tangibles made, is going to happen in our own community. So what are you doing to support stronger community economics?
So is there a question from the listeners that you want to put forward?
Yeah, that's a summary. They're basically saying, should the programs that are being brought out be tied to innovation or some way? Should subsidy be tied to innovation? Should they answer the moonshot?
Identified.
Pardon me?
Innovation or the challenge, I guess probably both. Sean or Robert?
It's both. Should they be tied? Should innovation be part of what government is asking industries or sectors or businesses to deliver if they're going to be part of economic recovery?
Sean, Robert, which one want to deal with that?
It's a really insightful question. Maybe I'll just start, Robert, and if you want to elaborate, there's a lot to unpack. Maybe I'll just zero in on a couple of specific aspects. The first on this question of self-sufficiency and rethinking supply chains. It's inevitable given the experience we've gone through, and given that similar conversations are happening in Washington. Canadian policymakers and business leaders are going to have to make sure that we're coordinating those activities with the Americans, so that our supply chains are repatriated out of Canada and they're thought about in a continental way. And here's an example where I think Carly's comments about working at the subnational level is so important. On the question of the role of public policy in innovation and how should we think about these questions, it's such an important one. Of course, we spend a lot of public dollars trying to catalyze and support innovation. That's one of the key insights of the paper, that it's a false choice between a laissez-faire model and an industrial policy model. We're not doing laissez-faire. We're just not presently being very strategic or intentional about how public policy supports innovation. Through our consultations for the paper, Alan, we frequently heard that the Canadian public policy by default spreads the peanut butter very thinly. And what we're saying here is that we can't afford to do that in the new environment. We need to be much more focused. We need to be much more intentional. We need to be, in a way, un-Canadian, in the sense that we need to really double down on the parts of the economy where we have a comparative advantage, where we can build scale, and where we can ultimately compete for global market share. But the final point I will make about this is that one of the tensions we grapple with in the paper, and I suspect will be one of the more controversial aspects, is how should we think about public support for business expenditure on R&D in the event that that business expenditure on R&D or that public investment leaves the country? We've seen a lot of instances where public investments in R&D and innovation have ultimately led to those companies, those scholars, those researchers leaving and taking that public investment in effect, or at least the intellectual property that it produced elsewhere. Jurisdictions like Israel, for instance, require that in instances where an Israeli firm that has benefited from public investments in R&D is acquired by a global firm, that money is paid back to the government. And so I think, well, we don't go that far. We certainly are of the view that we need to become much more nationally focused on cultivating innovation and R&D within Canadian firms. At the end of the day, remember, the rationale for public investments in innovation and R&D is the positive externalities. That's a clunky way of saying it produces spillovers within our borders. But if those dollars, if that intellectual property is being taken elsewhere, those spillovers are no longer within our borders. They're to the benefit of somebody else. Well, and so I think the question about how we should think about innovation spending, how we should think about conditionality, is an inevitable part of the industrial strategy framework that we're putting forward.
Well, let me ask Robert a supplementary question along the same lines, because in this and your earlier paper, New North Star 1, you make the point that Canada was not faring very well in the intangibles economy, even pre-COVID, for the points that Sean is making. We scale these companies up and they get purchased by somebody else. You make the further point, astounding to me, that there is not one Canadian company in the top 200 R&D spenders in the world. This is a chronic problem, the underinvestment of Canadian industry in R&D. What do you do to change that?
Well, in my view, Alan, is the way to co-create this demand and do this public-private partnership together. I think we've been very naive about public R&D and market outcomes, where countries have developed real industrial strategic policy, and this will be more the case. UK is doing this, Germany is doing this, France is doing this, the US is doing this, and China does this very well, is to link public R&D with market outcomes. This is what we want to achieve. This is what we need, where we need to go. And in Canada, we've had this naive conception that we'll fund universities and that's innovation policies. Well, we're missing a few links in the chain to get to global firms, as you say. So we do well at the inception level. We have a good startup scene, vibrant, I would say. You see that in Waterloo, you see that in Vancouver, you see that in Montreal. AI is a great example. There's a real buzz in Canada, and we should be proud of that. And the government has helped tremendously on that to fund this public R&D ecosystem, where now we are seen in the world as being serious on AI. What are we going to do with this? Are we going to be able to commercialize that intellectual property and do and create global firms. You know, of course, Canada is not the United States. Of course, Canada is not China. But I think we have amazing foundations in Canada. We have human capital, one of the best immigration system in the world, if not the best. A very good post-secondary education system. Why can we not leverage our intellectual capital? That's the foundation, Alan, of our paper. This is the new source of wealth, economically speaking. We have to cultivate that, and the government has a huge, important strategic role to play in this.
Carlin, right off the top, Robert laid out one of the things that has changed fundamentally is that the multinational order has kind of fallen apart, that we can't rely on the systems that we have or allies in particular. I mean, the Vancouver office, our BC office, does a lot of work with and on China. I would assume that the COVID-19 crisis has just aggravated any problems we've had with China, but would be interested in your view on, you know, where does China fit into our plans going forward in terms of a new industrial strategy?
Definitely. Before I answer that, I wanted to comment on something Robert had to say about Canada being a leader in AI. Over on the West Coast, the BC government, Canadian government, and this Cascadia Accord I talked about have really been cultivating AR and VR. So much so that we're the sort of second most successful region in the world for this. So there's actually a AR and VR conference or summit that gets held in Vancouver once a year. So another example of sort of along the lines of what Robert was talking about. With regards to China, so we do a lot of work in the Vancouver office with Chinese companies and businesses trying to do business with China. What I would say is there's already a lot of money from China invested in Canada. Going into this pandemic, we already had a sort of challenging relationship with China. But they've got a reputational issue, more so than they did sort of going into this pandemic. And so they're going to need to make friends coming out of this. And so it's kind of going to depend on sort of how much China needs Canada. Probably Canada needs China more so. But perhaps they look at softening some of their tariffs, maybe investing in LNG, that kind of thing, in order to sort of repair or help boost their reputation as we come out of this. Canada is a small, open trading country. We always have been, and we always will be. So I think China will continue to play a big investment role in Canada. But it is going to change slightly, and that will sort of depend on a lot of what we've been talking about along the lines of supply chains and sort of repatriating some of those supply chains in Canada.
Velma, we haven't even got to the so-called recovery stage yet. This government has spent upwards of $200 billion, it looks like, the deficit's going to be for this fiscal year, perhaps more. Does anyone even care about this in Ottawa right now? Is this weighing heavily on the minds of policymakers? Are they saying we can't do the things that Sean and Robert are advocating because there's no money left?
No, I don't think they're saying that, and frankly, I don't think there's any government in the world that's saying that. I mean, at current tab, we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% of GDP. We do understand that whether this is a V recovery or a U recovery, that there will be some spending that needs to happen on that part of the strategy. So there's more spending to come. And I think everyone understands that we need the recovery in order to stimulate that ultimate economic activity and the return to our tax base. So I think that business, because it's also a political and social consensus that there's a role for government, and it's a question of how we define that role. So I think we're going to end up in a very rich conversation about this. And as I said, I think this report feeds into that. So Alan, I want to just signal to you that I've got a list of 13 questions, and if I could just put a couple of them out in, because
I'm like Donald Trump, just one. Put out one.
No, I'm going to group them because there's a set of questions that relate to innovation and the innovation economy, and they're criticisms of what exists in our economy today. So they say, well, how are we supposed to restrict our ability to have our innovations go outside of our borders when we actually need that inbound investment? There are concerns about how we deal with multinationals when they really control supply chains, et cetera. There are concerns about how responsive we are on the innovation cycle. So can you maybe, they're really systemic questions about how Canada is going to deal with the discipline required for what you're putting forward in a challenge economy to match up or fix what's wrong with our current innovation system and get to what you're talking about. What should change structurally?
Go ahead, Sean. We're talking about discipline and the systems and the processes necessary. I mean, you make the point that industrial programs are very different from industrial policies and our industrial strategies. What is the glue that brings all of these disparate thoughts and demands forward? I mean, is this comes right from the center of the PMO?
I think you just nail it, Alan. What we need is the glue, is the framework. We have tons of industrial programs. We spend billions of dollars. By the way, to the deficit question, in our view, Sean and I, it's not necessarily a question of ejecting, billions of billions on top of what existing. To the contrary, it's more like aligning to this challenge-driven framework, and then aligning our core priorities to make sure that our industrial policy is intentional, it is bold, and it has concrete results. I think it's what matters. And obviously this is all a question of balance. It's not about, stopping foreign investment flows or saying, of course there will be multinationals in Canada. Of course there should be. It's a matter of the government of Canada saying, and the provinces, in fact, saying, this is what we want to achieve as outcomes, market outcomes, with the money we're going to invest in industrial policy, to be more intentional about it. Right now, what we're doing is we're trying to do everything, but we're not succeeding at really achieving any clear objective. So what we try to do with this paper is just put a big framework around it and say, guys, we need to get our stuff together and focus on what matters and what we think matters in this new economy or this economy. And this is as true for oil sands company that is true for a tech company, is that the value of the economy is shifting from tangibles to intangibles. I just read this great article, our Shell became a data company and using AI analytics to be more effective and productive. Everyone is going there to the same extent that everyone is going to a greener economy and trying to put that in their balance sheet as companies. So this is what we mean by focusing on the challenge-driven industrial policy.
I want to ask Sean, because you've worked at the center before in government. I mean, is there as Velma asked from the audience question? I mean, is there the discipline in government? I mean, everyone's fond of talking about whole of government approach, but we don't see much whole of government. Everyone pulling on the oars at the same time. What has to happen?
I think that's right, and Robert and I aren't naive about the challenges of an industrial policy approach. We really agonized over this recommendation, Alan, in part because of the limits around bringing greater coherence to a strategy that will necessarily involve different departments and even different levels of government. And of course, the election cycle can be an obstacle or a threat. But I would just make this point, that the intersection between the rise of intangible capital and the geopolitical competition we're seeing, that's only being exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, is going to require a new urgency in Ottawa. and it's going to require that we do things differently. It's not to say that our past policy framework was wrong. It was right for the particular circumstances in which it was designed, but the world has changed and our policy framework needs to adjust accordingly. And as I said at the very beginning, our goal isn't to push for this with a particular political party. It really is to develop and cultivate a new consensus, because there are great debates to be had between the different political parties, but Canadian prosperity, Canada's economic competitiveness, that ought to be beyond politics. That is too important.
Carling, we've heard a lot of talk about the importance of more collaboration, intersection between the private sector and public sector. I mean, in BC, they formally structured that in the form of the Economic Recovery Task Force, which includes private sector members within the government, labor, civil society, Indigenous. Tell me how that's working in your estimation, and do you see this as being more of a permanent means of making major public policy decisions, not just government in a vacuum, but again, reaching out to those other constituencies?
Sure. So yeah, as I mentioned before, the government, BC was one of the first, if not the first government in Canada to strike some sort of economic task force. So they have their Economic Recovery Task Force that has $1.5 billion to spend on reopening the BC economy. I would say the current government in British Columbia has done a pretty good job of being open to working with the business community and others in the province. So it wasn't a big surprise to see this task force formed, nor the members of the task force. It is absolutely the driving force behind the economic recovery strategy. The Minister Mungle, who's the Minister of Jobs and Economic Development and Competitiveness in BC, was on a webinar yesterday and was asked about the economic recovery, and she kept pointing back to this task force as the ones that will be advising the government and providing direction and advice and all that kind of thing. So I don't know that this task force will be a sort of a permanent thing going forward, but the business community has had good dialogue with the government so far, and I think this will strengthen that and continue on post-pandemic.
Is that a surprise, given that they're New Democrats? I mean, that's not seemed to be a holy alliance.
Well, yes and no. Obviously there's differences in perspective on various policies, but the NDP government has been quite good about listening to stakeholders across the economy. And BC is traditionally a natural resource economy. We've got tourism and tech and other things as well, but it's important to the government to listen to the business community in order to keep those sectors moving forward.
We're down to our last few minutes. So Velma, I've got a final question for you, and then I'm going to ask for Sean and Robert to close with their final thoughts. But we're focusing now on opening in a fairly gradual kind of way, but then recovery. We saw something very interesting in Alberta with the oil and gas sector, that pleading, obviously having multiple problems on a number of different fronts. The government's response was basically to go in and clean up orphan wells. One of the challenges that Sean and Robert have identified, obviously, is climate change. How likely are we to see the recovery packages, the stimulus focus, all be filtered through a green lens going forward with this government?
Thanks, Alan. I think we're going to see them filtered through a resilience lens. And I think resilience probably means something larger than it meant before. So I think the climate change question will be answered. I think that will certainly be something that we look at, whether that's in the labor market or in infrastructure, et cetera. I don't think it will. What do you mean
by resilience?
So I mean ecological resilience. I mean planetary resilience. But I think there's also a question about whether this is, there's also social resilience. And I wanted to bridge because there's a set of questions that have come in from
Velma, we don't have time. We're down to our last 5 minutes here. And
but just let me.
I want to make sure that Sean and Robert have a final say here.
I think though that this is something they'll want to touch on because it's relevant to COVID, which is that we also need to look at what is our social resilience, whether that's our public healthcare systems, reconciliation, a number of other things. How are we going to address some of the things that have been exposed in our social safety net as we're dealing with economic recovery? So it will be green, but will it also have labor or public health or other kinds of social safety net considerations in it?
Well, let me try to respond to that and wrap up. First of all, thanks again to Earnscliffe for enabling us to participate in this conversation and to talk about our new report with the Public Policy Forum. There's no question, Velma, that this experience is going to cause introspection and rethinking in various realms. Including social policy. The fact that Ottawa has had to produce 2 new income support programs on the fly is probably a sign that our social policy architecture needs reform. And as important as those conversations are, though, I would say that one of the takeaways for me of this experience is we can't afford to take our eye off the ball of economic competitiveness. As you said earlier, Velma, if we can get back to 3 or 4% growth, a lot of the problems in our society will be diminished. And in our view, the best way to get back on the path to economic prosperity involves this adjustment to our policy framework, a recognition that the world has changed, that intangible capital and the US-China rivalry will require Ottawa to think differently about the role of government and its part in cultivating innovation, technology, and ultimately scale so that Canadian firms can better participate in this new global marketplace.
Robert, last word to you. If you had one idea to leave with the audience, what would that be?
I couldn't agree more with Sean. I think countries that will succeed in this environment are the ones, and this is almost like a governance question, that will be able to overcome the short-term political calculations and think about the well-being of the nation going forward. And you think of China, for example, how good they have been at planning their future. The US is turning to this as well because they have the capacity to do so. And I think a country like Canada, to finish on a very positive note, I think is very resourceful. We have a lot of the elements that are needed to win in this global economy. And so we just have to go to work and collaborate together. But I do think the human capital, the immigration system that we have, there's no reason why Canada cannot be 10 years from now a great success coming out of this crisis.
Well, listen, good conversation, great work, Sean and Robert. We want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's made a real big difference, I think, to our audience. Velma and Carling, always terrific having a conversation with you guys. Those who have checked in, we will follow up with you. I'll send you a recording of this session, and otherwise, that's the end of our time. All of you be well and be safe. And again, thank you.